thank the Mellon Foundation for funding this series and funding the Connected Academics project that we're working on. The College Dean's Office for sponsoring the talk today, and the grad school for some of the support that they've given. And also my chair, Ricardo Ortiz, who first introduced me to Doris, and who was kind enough to be the interim PI on this project last year when I was on leave. So I've been managing Connected Academics funded by the Mellon Foundation for the past couple of years with Ricardo's help. And the goal of the project is nothing less than to reinvent doctoral education in the humanities in order to encourage advanced students in the humanities to consider and prepare themselves for diverse employment after graduation, both in and outside the academy. So one of our principles, of course, is outreach, right? The reaching out of the university into the world, but the other is what we're calling in-reach, the idea that humanities practitioners can reach into organizations, both public and private, and through a unique approach to complex problem solving, work towards solutions to different problems and issues out in the world. So with that, I want to introduce Professor Doris Sommer, Director of the Cultural Agents Initiative at Harvard, the Ira and Jewel Williams Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and of African and African American Studies. And I won't tell you everything that goes in her title because I can't get it all out on one breath, right? Her academic and outreach work promotes development through arts and humanities. She's worked specifically on a program called Pretexts in the Boston Public Schools. Among her books are Foundational Fictions, a book about novels that help to consolidate new republics. I love this next one, the title, Proceed with Caution When Engaged by Minority Literature, 1999, on a Rhetoric of Particularism, Bilingual Aesthetics, A New Sentimental Education, and then most recently, The Work of Art in the World, Civic Agency and the Public Humanities, which is a wonderful book. Mm-hmm. I was reading it as I was finishing the full version of my manuscript, and it was so inspiring. I can't possibly measure up to it, but it's just, she has a wonderful way of being both deep and broad. I think being able to speak to a much larger audience while still maintaining a kind of intellectual rigor that I found very exciting. So in this book, she celebrates humanities' approaches to social change in an effort to steer the humanities back to engagement with the world. Among the cases that she covers are top-down initiatives of political leaders, such as those launched by the former mayor of Bogota, Colombia. And I think you might talk about that a little bit
briefly.
Yeah. And then also bottom-up movements like the Theater of the Oppressed movement by the Brazilian director, writer, and educator Augusto Ball. Her inspiring book is filled with models, sources, and ideas that can be adapted to inform teaching and research about activist art and creativity. And I would suggest also that can inspire students in the humanities to think about different career options. Mm-hmm. And I'm really looking forward to her inspiring us today with her work on the case approach.
Thank you so much for your generous introduction, Catherine. And really, with a small group, I do want to try something out in the historical, etymological sense of essay. This is a trial, okay? So I want to make a case for culture. Let's make cases for culture. We need them now that humanities programs and arts institutions grow limp from lack of commitments, a symptom of general indifference to culture. In a world that moves fast on entrepreneurial and technological tracks, hardly pausing to consider the direction, the arts and humanities seem like a waste of time. Impatience with indirect or slow learning leaves culture at the rearguard of developments. There, dedicated defenders of precarious ground ask themselves how to bring more people into museums, libraries, concert halls, and theaters. This is a life or death question for many institutions today. Another question is how to safeguard the intrinsic value of the arts and humanities when the general public has lost a taste for the unhurried pleasures of doubt and discussion. Cases for culture might offer proactive responses to anxiety about the loss of taste, about exhausted patience, and the corollary waning of sociability. The case method is common in practically every field of academic research, except for the humanities, where arts and culture would come into focus. Cases identify a problem or challenge and then evaluate interventions. If we dared to respond to humanistic worries by designing stages for writing projects, a 25 to 35 page case for culture might look something like this. Identify a social challenge. Study the causes and context. Speculate on possible interventions. Implement one. And then design ways to measure impact and reflect on the results. One advantage of this format over existing essays in the humanities is that it would be readable to people outside the field. Another benefit is the built-in requirement to engage or to track engagement towards mitigation of identified problems, so that study and intervention can fuel one another in a virtuous cycle, sometimes called praxis. Academic work would then support restorative justice, addressing our ethical obligation towards victims of abuse of power, power that favors us. This way, scholars would confront the often unacknowledged bad faith that comes from investigating causes and conditions of suffering without taking responsibility for redress. Of course, intervention is risky, which underlines the ethical imperative to measure impact. It has felt safer for scholars to disdain engagement and to build their careers researching other people's problems. Research can also prime next steps. Improvements of readability and responsible risk-taking will follow from coming closer to other fields. And reciprocally, a new genre of humanistic cases would make contributions by adding the value of aesthetic interpretation. Scholars of business, law, politics, engineering, public health, and education have already pioneered and refined the case method. Some even dare to test conventional boundaries between subjective beauty and objective goods. At the Harvard Business School, for example, vanguard cases about art examine innovative leadership by Miles Davis. Another one examines performances to save water by Antanas Mokus from Bogota. And another, the civic benefits of teaching classical music in Venezuela with El Sistema. They show a path where arts and development can collaborate, especially if humanists do our part to reflect on the conditions and triggers of change. When the dynamics remain under-theorized, we forfeit some lessons to be learned. The name of change is art, to follow the thinking of Friedrich Schiller, John Dewey, and Jacques Rancière, among others. Art means making something new, something that surprises and engages groups of people. Writing about the aesthetic dimension of change promises to demonstrate that thinking like an artist is a condition for tackling social, economic, ethical, and political challenges. I actually teach a module called Thinking Like an Artist for a colleague in the business school. And with him, and with someone, another colleague in the engineering school and the director of the Harvard Art Museums, we're putting together a conference called Cases for Culture in February. I'll send you invitations, all right? Because they ask themselves, what triggers a change? They can tell a story, but they don't ask why the story's narrative works the way it does. And that's what humanists do. So we don't yet write cases for culture, and the dearth signals a skepticism between the humanities and almost every other field. Artists, however, have been taking steps across the divide between qualitative and quantitative evaluations. There's a useful synthesis in an essay by Americans for the Arts in Animating Democracy. To substantiate the intrinsic value of theater and performance, for example, some practitioners choose to count new beings. That's the name of a book, Counting New Beings, for funders who can renew grants and also for artists who want to develop. In fact, proposals for funding and reporting requirements may be the genres that come closest so far to conjuring new humanist cases for culture, though many applicants still consider the granting process to be a necessary evil that deforms art's value. Humanists worry even more than artists do about accounting, so interpretation lags behind on the path where art meets public commitments. Adding a critical edge of humanist analysis would open a path in furrows for new growth. The objective for new cases would be to learn what works, what doesn't, and why. Simply put, it's to learn. This is relevant for the humanities, unless we mistake an acquired allergy to practical involvement as a non-negotiable and sacred vow of abstinence. A couple of years ago, Danielle Allen addressed a group of undergraduate engaged scholars from a range of fields. She began by affirming that the work of universities is to pursue research and to learn new information. Then she paused, and she asked, how do you do that? Her question returned attention to engagement as an essential element of scholarship. Without it, research can remain derivative or academic in the narrow and unengaging sense. Good public humanities programs already move in the direction of service in prison education, voter registration, after-school programs, though a certain resistance to aesthetics and to theory in general tends to pull humanists away from academic work when they leave campus. Are standard demands to publish, in fact, incurably elitist and possibly damaging to a public mission? This would be a familiar double bind between doing good scholarship and doing good. Humanists usually don't count on cases to get out of binds. They allege that the effects of art are practically ineffable and certainly unquantifiable, that instruments for measurement miss the magic by reducing aesthetic effects to numerical values. The concern is real only if we remain uncreative about what and how to measure. If instruments were imposed or rigid, we might be stumped. But designing measurement is part of the challenge for innovative essays in the humanities. We can learn from artistic practice to be indirect, to ask unanticipated questions that elicit fresh responses. There are masters of this method, and one is former Mayor Antanas Mokus of Bogota. Featured as a lead artist in the Berlin Biennale of 2013, Mokus was recognized for launching public interventions through performance arts that managed to reduce traffic deaths, homicides, corruption, wasted water. I could talk forever about Mokus, but invite me to afterwards. In Berlin, if he wanted to be an invited guest, he was obliged to identify himself as an artist, though he had resisted the name, concerned that the luster of public office would tarnish from the flashiness of art. Here I want to feature his auxiliary creation. It was to measure the effects of antics. Mokus, the mathematician and philosopher, formulated surprising questions for broad-based surveys that disarmed skeptical citizens. Instead of asking them to identify troublemakers, he would ask why people obey the law. Statistics showed that respondents invariably credited themselves with lofty motivations of morality, while they assumed that others obeyed through fear. Citizens saw the numbers and got the point. They became self-critical about their assumptions of moral superiority and learned to admire lawful behavior in others. Admiration became an index of citizenship. Can we, in good faith, like Mokus, do anything less than measure what we do? As humanists, we claim to improve human lives by enhancing imagination, understanding, and judgment. How do we sustain that claim in an increasingly skeptical society? How do we confirm even our own conviction that art and interpretation are essential for human development? There's been far more hand-wringing and defensiveness in our camp than willingness to risk contamination with outside practices. The strong self-referential strain of scholarship in the humanities has, ironically, generated a kind of inbred scholasticism that recalls a medieval cloister. It can lead to a new humanism if we step beyond familiar limits. That renewal would take a distance from our work, always in progress, the way that artists pause to judge the progress of a new work and ask how to proceed. From a critical distance, it looks as if arts and culture have something to learn from the professional schools, though humanists will say those words, professional schools, with condescension, as if professions were too goal-oriented to be truly intellectual. A mutual allergy keeps a distance between humanists and professions. I remember distinctly that the preferred honorific title for teacher at Amherst College into the 1980s was the unmarked Mr., because professor was a paid job and sounded so workerly. And then my colleague Emma Dench, now the dean of the graduate school, told me that in Britain, the consultants for surgeons are considered at a higher rank than the surgeons, and you call them Mr. They have, they're doctors too, but because they have a higher rank, you call them Mr., because anything else sounds like a worker. Right? Humanists defend unencumbered thinking, and professional schools favor testing and measurable analyses. On the side of humanism, a reluctance to submit creative practices to the logic of cause and effect avoids accounting for the effects of art. On the side of practical people, decision makers for example, a disdain for culture and art as merely decorative or frankly a waste of time leads to cutting culture from budgets, except that collecting art is good personal business lately. Maybe you too are offended by the issue, because art and aesthetic interpretation should stay clear of practical concerns. They mire the disinterested freedom that creativity demands. One way or another, disciplinary thinking draws a line, a cordon sanitaire, to control for contamination between creativity and real life. Should we wonder behind this line why the humanities lose ground at universities, or why public policy gets stuck in zero-sum calculations? The disastrous consequences of the standoff between arts and policy are incentives to desanitize our thinking and to cross lines. The disconnect between freedom and accountability cost us credits on both sides. Humanities programs shrink at universities, squeezed by pressure from young people who want good jobs and by anxious parents and also well-meaning academic advisors. Have you talked to academic advisors who say don't take so many humanities courses? While uninspired policy decisions cripple human capacities for personal and collective growth. Cases for culture would help to suture the rift between imagination and reason in the complex system of our humanity. The tension between human faculties generates energy that could light new paths. Then imagination would ignite proposals for productive investments. This will mean clearing the decks of obstacles to coordination, doing some heavy lifting of stigmas that shroud the talents of potential partners. It is time for humanists to catch up, to add our own scholarly approaches to analyzing aesthetic effects, and to advance in a pas de deux with professional partners who are willing to spend time with us to explore twists and turns. Little section that's called Don't Count Me In. Most artists and their academic allies continue to be wary of, if not outright hostile about measuring the effects of what they do. Even if measurement were possible beyond qualitative testimonies, which seems unlikely or misleading to almost everyone who makes or studies art, the criterion of accountability remains frankly offensive to many creative people. Maybe this is because their creativity hasn't yet explored the art of indirect evaluation. Good models, like Mokus's surveys and cultural acupuncture, don't circulate in entrenched positions. And if I tell you that people ask me how to collaborate, and I said, Mokus is in town, let's learn how to measure. They met him, and they published something that has nothing to do with the lessons they learned, because art can't be measured that way. Measurement is anathema because it assumes a desired outcome, that is a purpose. And art, or beauty in general, is supposed to be purposeless, according to Immanuel Kant, as aestheticians will remind statisticians. But this apparent refinement falls short of Kant's sustained enlightened philosophy. He had a purpose. It was to establish political freedom. He wasn't interested in art. His approach was to locate and to exercise the faculty of judgment, a mental muscle gone flaccid from centuries of inactivity. Training judgment begins by developing disinterested aesthetic taste. And then, Hannah Arendt shows, it becomes an act for judging anything, a general faculty located just behind taste. Therefore, intransigence about political purpose truncates Kant's aesthetics to a short first moment, the necessary but brief experience of pleasure in the disinterested judgment of beauty. This moment, it's true, and I'll say another word about aesthetics because I'm talking to humanists, okay? We can get our other professional colleagues on board a lot easier. You've had that experience, okay? So this is some fuel for talking to humanists. This moment of disinterestedness is needed, You need a clean slate free of finances, fame, or any kind of desire, because a charm tainted by status or pre-existing preference would undo the equanimity that free judgment requires. And humanists have been understandably skittish about muddling this pristine position with instrumental or utilitarian purpose. Some colleagues proudly defend their right to be useless, I'm quoting, not as irresponsibility, but because they hope to secure free judgment from the grit of utilitarian interest. Paradoxically, this alleged dedication to Kantian aesthetics lacks stamina for his movement from one moment to another, so it short-circuits the aesthetics. It misses the master's point. Refusing to budge beyond initial innocence, where beauty is appreciated for its own sake, loses sight of the sequels. Disinterest primes future conversations about many themes, some of them gritty. Kant's movement goes from a personal and subjective judgment toward interpersonal agreement and ultimately to a new objective common sense. Agreement is the goal of Kant's aesthetics. Arendt appreciated this ambition when she joked that Kant, let me liberate this chair. Please. She joked that Kant never wrote a political philosophy, even though she published lectures on Kant's political philosophy. He was too smart to do that, she quipped, to risk irritating the monarch's censors, so he wrote the Aesthetics instead. And the Aesthetics works in part as a politics because his thinking is beautiful in itself. We enjoy the act of judging it. If that charm also enhances his purpose, Kant teaches us to call this added effect aggregate beauty, like the supplementary value of beautiful architecture for a functional building. This is no dismissal of art that works inside practical constraints. It's rather a salute to collaborations between functionality and beauty, between the predictable purpose of a structure, of a building, and the pleasing novelty that demands judgment and that generates potential agreement. Without art to unhinge expectations, new agreements are unnecessary and therefore unthinkable. Jürgen Habermas follows this line of poetic politics from Kant through Schiller to arrive at the creativity of communicative action. And we can talk about Habermas and politics if you want to. Humanists too can find that path from purposelessness to purpose on rereading Kantian aesthetics. A new close reading won't betray beauty. It will value beauty's charm to do difficult work in the world. Another section called Get Serious. Why do the creative arts seem practically irrelevant for most decision makers? This is not a rhetorical question, unless common sense has already dismissed the possibility that public policy and economic development have something to do with art. In fact, the arts provide essential elements for making good decisions. Those elements are judgment, artifice, and detail. There are probably more, but those are my favorites. Without these, we cannot address constantly changing conditions. Common sense, in the standard meaning I just used, refers to the unexamined assumptions that Kant targeted in his campaign against mental laziness. He banished conventional common sense to the prehistory of modern times when he resignified the term to mean the sense we make in common. Through subjective judgment first, and then followed up by intersubjective agreement. And he says in a lovely passage, he says, personal aesthetic experience is a contradiction in terms. It's always made for intersubjective communication. It's an incentive to talk to other people without interest. The unthinking and authoritative conclusions of pre-moderns ignore inevitable change. This amounts to psychological flabbiness, not only prejudice, and it can't keep up with modern activities. Progress depends on the exercise of judgment to evaluate ever-changing opportunities and obstacles. There's one sure way to exercise that mental muscle for judging detail and surprise, according to Kant. It's through aesthetics, the cool pleasure of judging something that had flashed hot for a moment. Change concerns social sciences too, but it concerns the social sciences with a view towards pattern making. As sciences, economics, politics, sociology, and even some strains of anthropology value what we can learn from repeated observations to understand what has happened and ideally to project what will follow. The lessons may lead to describing a law, that is, a scientific hypothesis. Social sciences train most leaders of business and government who learn to practice reasonable thinking towards reaching right answers. But to the degree that thinking can be free from prejudice and flexible enough to consider change, it comes close to aesthetics. The proximity could have brought decision makers near to embracing arts and culture as working partners, but that hasn't happened yet. Culture still means something different on each side of the divide. Raymond Williams puzzled over culture, among other key words, when he returned to Oxford after 4 years of military service in World War II. Somehow, he said, the English language had changed so much during so short a time that he literally could not follow a conversation. And the most vexing word named his own field of expertise, culture. Interviews, study, deliberation all led him to conclude that the word had two different, almost opposite meanings. For social sciences, culture amounts to patrimony, a set of shared things, beliefs, and practices, a mechanism of convergence and preservation. He did that because of his culture, right? That happened because of her culture. It's certainly not a promising arena for change and development, but instead a collective mindset that resists change. Rather than opportunities, culture poses dangers of offending whole groups of people who pray differently or eat, marry, dress, and talk differently. For artists and humanists, on the other hand, culture points to a field of divergent risks, trial and error, experimentation, often unhinging the very paradigms that patrimony defends. Remember, why am I not thinking of his name? Samuel Beckett. In Endgame, he says, try again, fail better. That fail better is both liberating and rigorous, and it's become the watchword for artists, at least in the English language world. Artists and scientists understand one another, both play with materials and explore their potential effects without necessarily projecting an outcome. The work is process-driven, not product-driven, in a sense of design thinking. Art is different from design. And Luis Kamnitzer goes crazy when people put them in the same sentence. Decision makers are not stupid. They understandably want development. To make money, for example, or to get elected for another. If they cut funding for culture in favor of technological advances or homeland security, it's probably, among other reasons, because they've been trained in the social sciences to be minimalist regarding culture, to do enough to avoid conflict with groups of people. As social scientists, they certainly do not learn to identify culture's processes as ignition for social, economic, or political progress. Artists will defend the cultural value of experimental process, while social sciences tend to grasp culture through its repeatable paradigms and products. We have opportunities. That means responsibilities. To suture the divide in culture with projects that strive for a double bottom line. That's a term I learned from the Social Innovation Studio at the Harvard Kennedy School for Government. The newly coined bilateral goal is to generate both income and social change. The two objectives support one another. Without money, change is not sustainable. And without the goal of social change, money does no good. Requiring both fiscal and ethical responsibility is a decision that we can make too. It would be to overcome the nagging double binds that have for decades paralyzed the humanities and other fields. The appropriate response to puzzling over a Gordian knot, like the tangle between thinking and acting, doing good and doing good scholarship, is to make new and bold moves, to cut. The concept of double bottom line conjures for me a case of culture called pretexts, and Catherine already mentioned it. It's my passion. It's a teacher training program that sustains itself through honoraria, so it makes some money, and that provides a social good by changing a pedagogy. It also bridges Raymond Williams's contradictory definitions of culture as patrimony and culture as experimentation. With pretext, teachers learn to offer challenging texts as raw material for making art and then for reflecting on the process. At the MLA convention, where I last saw Ricardo, we did a workshop and we played with the Panopticon chapter in Discipline and Punish. Maybe I can call up one of the funny songs that a group made of that. But you can give students anything to read if they get to play with it, if they get to act it, to do a fashion show, to dance it, to draw it. The combination of using text as prompts to make art and then to reflect on what you did by asking what did we do amounts to a protocol for developing high order reading, innovation because you're making art from the thing, and citizenship because everybody else is making something different and you learn to admire them rather than compete with them. It works for all ages and tastes, generating endless opportunities for scholarly analysis and theory. The steps are listen to a text, ask questions, create artistic responses, and think about the process. Participants play freely with the text, but art-making sessions are governed by consistent rules. Irreverently, individuals pull and poke at texts, but through a repeated protocol that obliges everyone to participate in a shared civic culture. Here, culture as divergent art meets culture as convergent practice. Measurably, personal expression advances along with shared reflection. Emotional intelligence drives and is driven by cognitive development. It's a mistake to focus on one at a time. An important dividend of this bottom line for pedagogy is a general feeling of admiration, as I said, for everyone in the group, because each artist contributes original work and an unscripted reflection. And the idea of everyone as an artist comes from that Kantian line through Schiller. That's why the last chapter of my book is called Play Drive and the Hard Drive. Like we've all got it, right? Admiration, we learned from Mayor Mokos, is the fundamental sentiment of citizenship. It responds to other people's particularity and anticipates their valued contributions. It's very unlike feelings of tolerance or even respect, which keep speakers at the center of their sentences. Humanists have opportunities like this one to direct interpretive work towards engagement and accountability, while decision makers can advance from orderly camps towards igniting change with art. Change, after all, relies on thinking like an artist and then thinking together with fellow social actors. Otherwise, on either side of culture's divide, we choose and lose. Thank you. I would love to hear your comments.
What is the role of hierarchy in that environment? Is it possible to create a non-hierarchical environment which actually would allow for all of us to participate in decision making, participate in creating culture for all of us who is interested or not?
I'm going to give you a Freudian answer. Freire said, don't fight systems, because he wasn't referring to Foucault, but we know what Foucault would say. You know, you make a resistance, and then the pressure grows, and you make more resistance, and you get into a bad spiral. The image that Freire used is the vicious circle of the Hegelian dialectic, right? He says, don't go there. Find a fissure, find an open space, find a break, and insert yourself. Do something interesting and see if you can grow it, okay? So I don't think that if we tried to change hierarchies, we would get very far. But when I go with my little pretexts, which I want to tell you about in terms of hierarchies, changing hierarchies, I go with my pretexts and a decision maker says, that sounds interesting. Do you have any studies? Like if I'm going to invest public money in something, I need to know that this is a legitimate practice. Do you have some studies? How many children learned how to read this year? What was the level of bullying in the school? The rhetoric sounds great. Let me see some numbers. And what am I going to say to them? I say, you're right. Let's figure out how to do the numbers. How do you measure advance in the humanities? Let's be clever like Mokus. So I think the ball is in our court now. Because when I talk to other people, they say, you know, it would be so cool to have a new case where the speculation part, the glue part, is visible. Because, you know, my friends in economics, they say, we read a lot of cases and we see what works and what doesn't work, but nobody bothers to ask why. You know, the interpretive pleasures that we develop in the humanities are useful. They're not only fun, they're useful. So I think we need to do our part because we have people on the other side of the ping pong table. They're just waiting for the ball. That's why when you know, the two people who decided to do the conference with me were the engineer and the entrepreneur. When they got on board, you know, the dean of the graduate school and the head of the museum said, great, you know, let's do it. But practical people want to work with us. And I want to say something about pretext, which is also Freudian. What happens in a society where public schools, and this is predictable everywhere except for Finland, and nobody bothers to see Finland as a model. They just see it as, you know, this pretty poster child. It's not like we're not learning lessons, right? What happens in every country, especially poor countries, you go into public school and kids are sitting in rows, and there's one person in the front. And that person knows all the questions and knows all the answers. And there's one answer per question. Okay, what does that do? What does that do? I mean, I'm working in countries like Colombia that is desperate to make peace with everybody. Mexico, where the level of violence is, you know, almost immeasurable. What that does is create authoritarianism, right? That's clear? One person in the front knows everything, has all the power. Say yes and I'll go on. Authoritarianism, and that creates corruption. Why? Because when you know that you're in an unfair system, how do you treat that system? How do you treat yourself in that system? You figure out a little way out, right? A little budge. A little way to, you know, have a little freedom. So you have to be corrupt in a bad system. And then it creates violence. Because when everybody wants to be the one bright kid who has all the right answers, you compete with everybody, and everybody hates that bright kid. And you can't wait to beat him up. We're creating everything bad by a nice, orderly classroom. So the way to deal with hierarchy is from the top and the bottom. That's why I organized the book that way, from the top and the bottom. Give the decision makers a case that they can read, 25 to 35 pages with a graph. The dissertation about aesthetic effects in Henry James, that's the big thing that you wrote, but you can convert that in, you know, your intervention in a high school or in a prison or something, you can convert that into a case. Something readable, something that makes sense to a person outside of the field.
Is that us graduate students who are working pretty much at the hardest part of the constraints of the institutional requirements, how do we convince our advisors, our chairs, the people who read our grants, that we want to do more creative work and that work is valuable?
Let's say you write a seminar paper, not a dissertation yet, but of the 16 courses you have to take as a graduate student. How many do you have to take? 20. All right. So you write a seminar paper based on the work that you do in a second grade class with The Little Prince. Because, for example, you know, I would love to show you what we do in pretext, but you go in, you read it out loud because you can't assume that everybody knows how to read or wants to read, or they're dyslexic, or they're still illiterate. And little boys who are illiterate, minority boys who are illiterate in second grade, by the time they get to third grade, you know they're going to go to jail. Everyone knows that. There's a hemorrhage in this country and we're not doing enough about it. Okay? So, you go to the second grade class, you read The Little Prince, 2 chapters, 1 chapter out loud, and everybody has to ask a question. 30 kids ask questions. Do you think you're going to get some good leads for an analysis with 30 little kids asking questions?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay, all right, so hold that moment, okay? You're taping or you're taking notes, or they have to, you know, if they write, then write out their questions, and you say, cool, and then people speculate on answers. And the power of reader response theory, the power of the multiplicity of interpretations lands. The diciness between the definition of creativity and intellectual work deconstructs. You feel what deconstruction is. They're two, you know, they're 2 different words, but you can't separate them. When you do in good engaged work at a high level, not, you know, not the Mother Teresa kind, all right? You're teaching people how to fish, okay? When you do good engaged work, people will surprise you and you become the beneficiary. And you do really interesting essays. My favorite interpretive essay is by Donna Haraway. She wrote an essay on, what is it called? Mothering or Mother, some African novel with the name Mother. If you look up Donna Haraway novel Mother, you'll see it. She starts off, first paragraph, I can think of at least 5 ways to read this novel, right? So that's why I'm remembering it, because I'm thinking about a second grade class that has 30 ways. I can think of 5 ways to read this novel. And then she does 5 different readings. And it's brilliant. She doesn't have to decide that this is right or that's more convincing. No. Everybody's going to have a different read. And talking to people, she's got more than one. What is reading response theory? You know, we're used to saying that a text is inexhaustible. It has every reading, right? But we just say that. Take your favorite, you know, high theory idea, and you'll see that it lands and that it's useful. Try it. And then you'll tell me. Good.
You know, I'm just wondering what more we could say about, the sort of the alternative models. And again, we're using the case of a certain kind of pedagogical innovation that's happening in primarily primary education to do a really kind of important, what feels to me like explosive ground level work, right? Again, with culture, with art, with the aesthetic, but it's, you know, it's starting with, with the example of second graders encountering The Little Prince in a different way than they otherwise might if it were just being taught conventionally to them, right? It's formalized and institutionalized in the classroom in a way that it can grow from there because of the model that you've set up, right? But I'm wondering, especially for just, you know, anybody in this room who might be, for example, a first-year college student in a writing class, and who are collected here because they're in a writing class, not because there's a common interest in anything that we're talking about. Right. But who basically sorry? Okay, but who and I'm just like, this is about
No, good.
Hypothetically. No,
good.
Where you know, it feels to me like part of what we're talking about is again, any given person's lifelong narrative of engagement with the aesthetic, but where for a lot of people it may seem to be primarily an engagement with entertainment. Right,
Okay.
and with entertainment that you either just encounter in your life every day because it's on your screen, or you encounter because you go and seek it out and actually pay for it, right? And I'm wondering about, so those are my extremes. Those are my extreme sort of spaces for understanding sort of the power and the effectiveness and the promise of the I think the amazing intervention that you're trying to describe here.
One of the criteria for identifying art and not entertainment, this comes out of Dewey, right? But before Dewey, Shklovsky was very close to this, and he said it even more dramatically. Art is difficult. You don't get it. It stops you. It's friction, right? And that's out of a Kantian line too, because it makes you need to talk to people. What is it good for? If it were just entertaining, it would be pleasing. It would be pleasing, and it wouldn't need processing. Art needs processing. So I think that it's easy to disengage art from entertainment. And Dewey says it very well in Art as Experience. Art makes you tingle. It makes you want to respond with something else creative. And entertainment relaxes you. It satisfies. See? That's okay. So I'm channeling Dewey. I'm not making it up. But it's interesting to me, that line of formalism that comes from Kant and Schiller through Shklovsky and has stayed with us, right? Art is hard. Art is hard. So when kids get that, and they do get it, when kids get that, they say, "Oh, this is so hard," and you say, "Do you want to stop doing it?" No, I want to figure it out. They get what it feels like to be on a tightrope between excitement and anxiety, and they don't exactly know what it is, but if you're not there, you're not living intensely.
Right.
And to build that into a kid's expectation at school, rather than getting the right answer, when you talk to middle school children and 9th graders, 10th graders, and you say, "Why did you drop out?" Do you know what most kids answer in this country? It's so boring. Huh?
Lack of intensity?
Lack of intensity. Lack of challenge. It's so boring. There's somebody who's just talking at you and making you write things. But if you say, and we've done this with so many different kinds of texts. I asked a colleague at MLA 2 years ago, I said, "What should we play with this year?" And he said, "Well, the 10th graders in Connecticut," he's from Connecticut, from UConn, 10th graders in Connecticut all have to read Walden Pond. They hate it. It's hard, it's boring, blah, blah, blah. I said, "Good, we'll take a few pages of Walden Pond." And we played with them. And the very fact that you don't like it gives you fuel to go after it, to make art from it. The irreverence is an edge in art that points towards change. And this is not the way decision makers ever get lectured to about art, ever. Right? So why would they think that art will help them do whatever they have to do? It's just good for investments, for personal investments.
Humanists hierarchize creativity as if we own it, right? We can't have the professional
professional
education.
schools.
We're not going to have that. And so in my class, how many of you are in MSB? It's a bunch of people in the business school, right? But they're taking the sort of law, justice, kind of a mushy course. We're reading Billy Budd right now. I don't think they like it very much, but some of them are playing with it in a creative song.
Good.
So I guess part of what I'm asking is, what can we, it's no wonder that business people and policymakers ignore art, because we tell them all the time that they have nothing to do with it.
I know, we call them Philistines. Let's make more conferences on cases for culture and invite precisely the, I want people from business schools, I want decision makers, I want a mayor, a governor to come because, you know, Harvard Business School is going to host a conference. Why wouldn't some people who take themselves seriously come? And then we have somebody to talk to. But we have to do our part. We have to do our part.
So what does humanities training bring
Yeah.
that perhaps the business school wouldn't bring or something the sciences wouldn't bring? So I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, so far, I mean, what we're doing together is a work in progress, right? We're trying to make something up. And what we're trying to make up is a new humanism, because we are now in a new scholasticism. I mentioned that briefly, but I think it's worth just owning, right? We're in a university where the humanities is all about self-referential, detail analysis that doesn't have incidence in the outside world. I think that that's the way we talk denigratingly about scholasticism in the Middle Ages, right? So let's be new humanists, and we have to make it up, all right? So one path is an invitation by social scientists and people in the professional schools to fill in the gaps between what we do and what works and what doesn't, right? Our knack and pleasure in speculation is something that they're very interested in. Also, a training in enjoying doubt. People even in design schools, but certainly in engineering, in politics, in business and everything else, they want to know what works. They start with doubt, they start with questions, but they want to get over the doubt as soon as possible and do something, right? What does a humanist do? A humanist, huh?
Complicated.
Complicated. Oh, that's a good answer. Next. What else you got, right? Good answers. Good answers are many, and that is another opening that practical people see in humanists, that the options are varied, that you don't have a straight line. You can meander a bit, make connections that are surprising. The name of art is surprise. So I think between the speculation, the taste for doubt and difficulty, the meandering, those are some bullets. Here's another one. Here's another one. The artist is not a victim. If you want to energize, empower, all those words that we like to use about democratizing, treat people like artists. Because you can have terrible problems in your life. You can have illness, you can have trauma, you can have, and we all do have something. But when you turn that pain into an incentive for art making, who's the boss? Who's in control? The artist is not a victim.
And I think that, in a way, the humanities are opening up to that idea and are trying to think about how their work is going to inform policy making and how we can create like a language that we speak among all. But I find that the other way around, it sometimes gets a little bit confused, and that the humanities are seen as a language of translation. Of like sciences, for instance, or like I do environmental humanities, and many times I am told like, why not call a specialist on this field? And I'm like, I'm a specialist, it's like, but like ecology is still seen as this language that sciences speak. And I wonder, what are the ways that we can change that view from outside the humanities and make this very complicated languages that we sometimes speak not translatable, but accessible and interesting.
Yeah, that was the first question.
Yeah.
Our Polish colleague. Tell me your name again.
Ivana.
Ivona, yeah. that was the first question, like, how do we get them to listen to us? And my answer was, well, let's make a move. The other thing I think we can do is make a new lexicon. I tried one. I have, you know, I love keywords, right? Raymond Williams wrote a wonderful book. I also love what's his name? The French philosopher critic who wrote the Discourse of Love. Vault, okay? Just organizing alphabetically pleases me. It's arbitrary, right? It's arbitrary. Here are useful words, and you'll find them in alphabetical order, which means no logical order. I love that, okay? And both of them, I think, offer us a model for remaking ourselves. Why don't we do, you know, workshops where we present 5 words that we think are important here and re-signify them?
I mean, I think part of it, and again, this just goes to, it's a different version of what I was trying to say before, I think, in some ways, right? That I think we also do ourselves a disservice when we think of somehow, we think of the humanities and the sort of the attention to the arts that they serve as a kind of exception, as something that seems to happen in a corner to some people who are stranger than everyone else, who's sort of out in the world just being human. When, no, actually, you know, when you look around and you look at every history of every civilization,
Right.
there's never been one
Right.
that actually wasn't centered on, wasn't defined by, and didn't sort of know itself primarily, right, if not exclusively, through the arts and through the symbolic and through how it made beauty in the world in a way that no one else did, right? And that, you know, that I'm simplifying here in a way just to sort of make the point, right? And so the whole idea that somehow, you know, this is a stuff that we could do without, right? That we could live and breathe without it as a culture, as a civilization, as a society, as a species. It's disproven by actual history, right? That's just something. And so when you look out into the world and you think, okay, well, who are the non-humanists that we're trying to reach? Well, one of the first things you can assume if you ask the right questions and if you know how to ask this is like, how many of them are artists, or were artists, or were trained in something, or were a performer? You know, took music, took art when they were little and loved it until they didn't anymore because at some point they either outgrew it or decided that it was something to put aside, right? It's really fascinating. I mean, it's not.
That's right.
You know, and also to that extent, like, what do you love to watch? What do you love to read? What takes you away from your own life?
You know, I have to follow up with an anecdote along these lines. I was in Medellin, Colombia, at a UN conference on safer cities, because Medellin, at the end of the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s, was a city that had reduced homicides by 90%. Can you imagine? There were a lot of deaths in Medellin, and the then mayor Fajardo managed to reduce deaths. And one of the people who engineered that program was a psychologist who worked in the jails. And he didn't talk about art in the official meeting, right? Art didn't look important. But at dinner, we asked him, how do you do it? And he said, well, you interview all of these young criminals or paramilitaries or, you know, everybody with a gun. You interview them when they come in. Because young men in Colombia and Medellin don't expect to live beyond the age of 20. So they live hard, they live fast, and then they're dead. Okay? How do you get them to anticipate a longer life and a nonviolent life? That's the challenge. That's why he was a psychologist taking, you know, doing the intake and not, they didn't put a warden there. So his technique was to ask each one individually in an interview what their fantasy was. Not why do you do bad things, what's your fantasy? And each one, he said, each one had an arts fantasy. I want to play guitar, I want to dance, I want to paint, I want to do rap, I want to do this. Everyone wanted to be an artist. So that gave him the simple idea of hiring local artists, mid-range people, they didn't have to be great international stars, to do workshops with these prisoners every morning at 7:30, and to go to the workshop you had to be showered and have had breakfast, so people had to get up early, get on time, do a regular routine, and enjoy the workshop. And after 3 or 4 months, they said, well, what do we do when we get out of here? We still want to paint and we still want to do guitar, but they needed jobs, so there was some job training. But the draw to want to live was art. Just, yeah.
So the idea of the case.
Yeah.
All right, so before I went into academia and got a PhD in English, I was a lawyer. Yeah, and one thing
I saw
hated-
that, I remember
I
that.
hated about practice was that everything was a case, right? That you have a case and then it's over, and then you have another case and it's over, and it's
Right.
all about closure, solving a problem, and then
Right,
you're done.
right.
Because my brain doesn't work that way.
Right.
It's extensive, so I still was thinking about, the case I had 5 years ago, when it was long gone. So it worries me a little bit to use the case model
Right.
because of that, right? But I don't think you're quite using it.
Do at least one intervention, measure it, and then speculate about lessons that you learned and what's next on the agenda. So it wouldn't be a closure, it would be a chain reaction. And in the case, you would keep alive options that you didn't take. I mean, it's not a proposal to solve all of our problems in 25 pages, but it's a gesture, I think, in the direction of taking ourselves more seriously. We say that the humanities is important for the world. Can we say that convincingly even to ourselves? Beyond it being a personal experience. Can we get beyond the immediate subjective response to the intersubjective? That's the Kantian move, right?
Yeah, and I like the process, right? I guess I'm thinking about the genre of the case and what kind of
We would
conventions we're going to have.
we
twist a little bit.
we would twist the conventions. We would twist the convention. And the good news is that the people in the conventional conventions are waiting for it. They're dissatisfied. They feel the same as you. The thing is closed, you didn't learn anything because another case doesn't refer to the one you just did. I think we have to invent it. We can't, we have to invent everything, but if we can package it in a way that looks manageable and attractive,
Without becoming trapped by the package.
without being trapped by the package, exactly. Exactly. But look, how many traps do we function inside of? I mean, any good artist looks for limitations before they start. I have a box of crayons. How many colors am I going to use? If I think I'm going to use them all, I get confused. Right? I have this space. What am I going to use for my dance routine? Mokos does this very funny thing when he gives a lecture. He takes a piece of chalk from a chalkboard and he draws a square and he says, I'm staying in this. And that way I control the space. Because the way a prisoner feels free is to impose another restriction through his own will. Okay? Artists work well in restrictions. So let's think of this genre as an imposed restriction that you get to show off in. Look at that cool thing I did in 25 pages. Or, look at this funny measurement that I invented and it's significant. Or that's a challenge. Let's think like artists. Let's think like artists. That's my theme in the work of art in the world, right? So humanists, we make long careers studying art and we don't appropriate. We talk about appropriation. We don't appropriate. We're risk averse. How are we going to make a change in the world if we're risk averse? So we'll make, some things will work, some won't. but the energy and the pleasure of inventing will keep us going. We'll try not to do damage. But how are we going to change anything if we don't take a risk? Moko says, that people criticize him for thinking counterfactually, because he's crazy, right? He says, how do you make change if you don't think counterfactually? So he makes a joke of all of these serious critics. He's a philosopher too.
But what's interesting here is that we're talking about developing law followers through art, which is in some ways the essence of rejecting certain kinds of laws or demanding that you create your own set of laws. It's a really interesting interplay.
It is, and I think we need the interplay because we've been on either side for so long that we're stuck.
I love the idea of admiration.
Right? Isn't that a relief?
It's creating a community.
It's creating a community through the particular quality of the other person. Right? If you say, look, we're all equal. Look, we're all equal. And somebody says, I'm not equal. I have blue hair. I want you to notice that I have blue hair. Yeah, but that's fine. I don't mind. But I want you to notice. There's a way that we denigrate cultural, racial, gender differences by saying we're all equal, we're fine, we're nice. Instead of feeling buzzed, irritated, curious. So admiration is a way to generate citizenship or civics in general, because not everybody is a citizen. Moko talks about civic culture, cultura ciudadana, because the word citizen is dicey in a world of immigrants, legal and illegal. So, to create a civic culture through admiration is to be alive and to enjoy people's differences. Thank you for your attention, and I hope we continue to talk about this.